Cilliers, good evening. Thank you for joining us. Was the writing on the wall? Was there no other way to go but to end the national state of disaster tonight?
Well, it's become clear, even with the statement by Minister NDZ, that the government had no choice but to end the national state of disaster. Simply, as I told you the last time we spoke, because COVID-19 has for long now not conformed to any reasonable definition of a disaster. It's not placing strain on the health system. It could have been ended. The national state of disaster could have been ended months ago, and the economy and society would have been better off. So these extraordinary powers were not necessary, and I think the government has not had a choice but to do so. Unfortunately, it comes very late, but the important point for the DA is that government now seems to want to transplant the powers that it enjoyed under a national state of disaster to permanent law in the form of the health regulations, which are now open for public comment until the 16th of April.
Do we have a real basis, though, to believe that, Mr. Brink, that that's government's intention? As you say, they're out for public comment, and no. By no means are they, law that's cast in stone, are they?
Well, they clearly provide for many of the powers that government exercised under the national state of disaster. So if you read the regulations, and we can only accept that what the draft regulations provide is government's intent. Things like mask mandates, restrictions on gatherings can be imposed if these national health regulations are promulgated into law. Furthermore, government can acquire the power to force certain individuals suspected of having a so-called notifiable illness, not defined clearly in the regulations, to submit to mandatory medical examinations, mandatory medical tests, and even mandatory treatment. So, compelled treatment. Now, we don't obviously want to raise disaster scenarios here, but this is not powers that should be enjoyed by government on a permanent basis. And what we fear is that, especially because government won't even let go for a period of 30 days of its extraordinary lockdown powers, what we fear is that this is indeed the intention of government to exercise on a permanent basis what the president has, in fact, this evening himself described as temporary and extraordinary executive powers.
Yeah. Do you think that there is an argument to be made, Mr. Brink, that obviously learning from this disaster, that we can't have an open-ended health framework that, in a sense, doesn't take into account a possible future disaster? Don't you think that the health regulations, imperfect as they may be, is part of preparing the country to deal with a similar pandemic, not even necessarily linked to COVID, but other non-communicable diseases, right? So that, in a sense, it's a proactive step, so that should such a disaster happen, we are ready, we are not caught off guard like we are caught off guard, with COVID. All of you are caught on guard because in the first 21 days in lockdown 1, we all agreed that that was the way to go with all these regulations. This protest came lately. The protest did not come at the beginning.
So the important point is that the agreement, the broad agreement by everyone in those first 21 days was that government needed to do whatever needed to be done to determine the extent of the problem and how to respond to it. But that initial agreement certainly was not an agreement to grant government permanent powers. And had that issue been taken to Parliament and been deliberated in Parliament on an emergency basis, I'm sure Parliament would have then given the same answer. But as circumstances changed, perhaps Parliament and the public would have given a different answer. So we cannot give government power to provide for every single disaster contingency that exists, to give that forward power and assume that that is what is required. What is in fact required is for government to trust the public, to bring the public into its confidence, And if it's necessary to declare a state of disaster or to take any other extraordinary measures, to then make that case at the particular point in time, to say, we're doing so, it'll be in place for X amount of days on a temporary basis, we will be reviewing the situation. Unfortunately, what we had with the national state of disaster was a continuous rolling over by the minister with the president's support, without the minister or the president going to parliament and saying, this is the reason we are rolling over the national state of disaster. So no, we can't make forward cover
but you agree that
provisions
rollover
in law in case a possible pandemic of this nature happens again, because we don't even know what the nature of the next pandemic will be.
Yeah, that's true. But if you're running a business, surely you'd have to have contingency plans. You are saying to me now, and please clarify if I'm getting you wrong, that there's no need as a nation to make such contingency plans, right? We must wait until a disaster hits and then we'll start running around. Surely that's why you had a legislation dealing with a state of disaster, or what happens should there be a disaster. When there are even other natural disasters, there is some kind of a process that is not manufactured when the disaster hits. If there's a tornado or a flood or fires, there are procedures, isn't it? So I'm finding it difficult for you to throw the baby with the bathwater and say there should be no regulation at all. We'll see, in front there. When it happens, we'll then decide there. That's what you are saying.
No, I'm saying don't give extraordinary powers to government in case there might be an emergency or a disaster that looks like the previous one. And JJ, let's just look honestly at what needed to be done the last time around. Field hospitals, for example, to deal with the pressure of COVID on the health system. You did not need extraordinary extra parliamentary powers to put up field hospitals. You did not need extraordinary extra parliamentary powers to procure the vaccine and to ensure its distribution. You didn't need the measures that government took to procure at great public expense and what ended up as a massive corruption scheme, all of the PPEs and measures such as spraying schools that we had in Gauteng, with millions were misappropriated. So government did not need all of the powers all of the time that were exercised under COVID, and in fact it neglected to do things that could have been done. The contingency plans that you speak about, ordinary things, planning for the future, listening to scientists, changing and adapting to circumstances. Those things don't need an executive that doesn't account to Parliament.
Because
they
of
need
run
good
out of
management.
Time, Mr. Brink, just tell me quickly, just pick one or two regulations in the current draft that you would throw out immediately, just quickly.
No mask wearing, no restrictions on gatherings are required. I mean, those are the essential restrictions that remain. But remember, just because those are the only restrictions now, don't mean that they'll be the only restrictions forever. So that's what I'll do. And just as an aside, we do welcome the extension of the 350 Rand, as well as planning for how that support can be extended in future. But again, that does not require long-term disaster management, extraordinary government